Hey, good morning all, and thanks for joining us today on Adapt Centre's 2021 series of webinars. So listen, guys, folks, I hope you got your coffee at the ready and looking forward as much as I am to tuning in to our panelists later on in this session. Just some housekeeping before we start. By way of intro, my name is Edmund O'Connor and I look after the industry engagements with the Adapt Centre, which is the SFI Research Centre for AI-driven digital content technology. And we work across multiple domains, you know, from industries that are working and involved in digital content, media technologies, health, fintech, and startups, and data governance. And of course, with data governance underpinning all the industries that we're actively engaged with. So the format this morning is quite straightforward. Each of our three panelists will have about 10 minutes or so to walk through their views and perspectives and undoubted opportunities in this space. And then we will have 10 minutes or so Q&A session and wrap up with the promise that we'll keep this as close as possible to the 45 minutes. And for sure, if you have questions, just remember, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and cover as many of those questions as possible at that time, or we'll follow on after the webinar. So as I mentioned, you know, there's going to be an exciting calendar of webinars for Adapt. This is the first one in the series. Next month, we have a webinar on e-health and subsequent webinars in the area of AI and transforming digital content over the next few months. So we're going to be busy. So, but you can keep up to date through our social media channels, our website at adaptcentre.ie for more information. Now back to this morning's webinar, which is entitled The Privacy Imperative. Now, before we turn to our panelists, I just want to put that into context in today's conversation and just join the dots. So the opportunity that we see here at the Adapt Centre, working with industry, is really the potential reward for brands who approach the usage of personal data responsibly, with global consumers much more likely to be loyal to a brand that they trust and who are transparent with how they use their data. So data protection is much more than compliance. It moves more to the spirit of the law. But the topic itself has many layers, you know, with companies working on and trying to make sense of, you know, big data, or someone put it to me recently, it's just data. Vast amounts of data within organizations by looking at data quality, data standards, looking at technologies that enhance the privacy of data at an organizational level, and how to create standards around combining data sets, not only within, but across companies and industries, which is the real ability to unlock unlimited potential. And with that, of course, this very topic also carries inherent privacy, security, and ethical challenges that can bring legal and regulatory scrutiny to business practices. So with that, I'm delighted this morning to welcome our panelists who are going to explore some of these topics. And just to give you a quick intro and bio to each of them before we start off the session. We have Aoife Sexton, who is the Chief Privacy Officer and Chief of Product Innovation at Trūata, which is a privacy-enhanced data analytics solutions provider that specializes in privacy risk assessment, de-identification, and true anonymization of data. Now, Trūata enables businesses to unlock powerful insights with their suite of proprietary solutions while complying with the highest global data protection standards. And Aoife, who I know and I've heard and I'm looking forward to listening to her this morning, is a technology and privacy lawyer with over 25 years experience working in and with companies in the technology sector. And joining Aoife is Pat Mccarthy from Huawei. Now, Pat is an AI security and privacy protection advisor working out of the Huawei Cyber Security Transparency Center in Brussels, and serves on the SFI Insight Centre's governance board. And Pat has also worked in leadership roles at Ericsson, Telecardia, ADC, Nortel, and IBM in strategy, product management, and R&D. So brings a huge amount of experience to the table. And of course, we've got our very own Ray Walshe. Ray is an assistant professor with DCU, principal investigator with the Adapt AI and Digital Media Research Centre, exec director of the Data Science Foundation, and part of the European Commission working group on ICT standards, along with other advisory and exec roles, and has a lot of experience working across the privacy preserving data ecosystem, international standards, and big data, and with a significant amount of experience working out of the Adapt Centre, working and engaged with industry in this space. So that's the panelists, a stellar lineup this morning. So thanks Aoife, Pat, and Ray for joining us. I'm delighted to have you folks. So to people that are tuning in this morning, I would just say grab your coffee, and if you're lucky enough, a pastry, and let's kick off. So firstly, I would like to pass you over to Aoife. If I may, Aoife, you should now have hopefully access to be able to present.
Okay, let's see if we can turn screen. Okay, can you see my screen? I think I'm still muted.
Yes, you're okay.
We can indeed.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. All right. I didn't want to be the first person who needed to be told to unmute themselves. Good morning, everybody. And Edmund, thank you so much for that introduction, for teeing up today's conversation and a little bit around Trūata. As you mentioned, we're a Dublin headquartered company. We've over 80 staff based out in Sandyford. And our mission is to empower organizations through the use of privacy enhanced data solutions to unlock value from their data whilst protecting customer trust and brand loyalty. So really at its heart, we're all about helping organizations innovate with data, but do so in a privacy preserving and a privacy respecting way. And we believe you can do both. We don't think it's an either or a zero sum game. We think you can innovate and derive incredible and valuable insights from data whilst respecting privacy. I mean, you've talked about data there, and I think companies and organizations are increasingly realizing just the importance and the value of the data assets that they hold. And they're trying to see how they can unlock value to help them, particularly coming out of COVID as we emerge. What can we do? What can organizations do to improve their customers' experience, improve their products and services, drive competitiveness? How can they take more data-driven decisions? But at the same time, they are understanding the constraints that data protection regulation places on them, particularly in Europe, but also increasingly around the world. And if you're doing business globally, there are new and also amended legislations and laws that are increasingly coming into play. So data, whilst an incredibly valuable asset, can also be a liability. And if you get your data strategy wrong, you can, of course, expose yourself to fines, but also, as you mentioned, Edmund, very importantly, how you demonstrate to your consumers how you're using their personal data will ultimately mean that you're building trust with the consumer, or if you get it wrong, you will create reputational damage, which can take a very long time to come back from. So this is what we call the data dichotomy. So what I'm going to do this morning is talk a little bit about some of the technical solutions that are either available today or are emerging that are there to help organizations, particularly as they're working with data at scale. So, you can't manage your data from Excel spreadsheets anymore. You need technology to help you work with data and manage your data assets at scale. So in particular, I'm going to touch upon anonymization and pseudonymization, but there are also increasingly commercialization of new technology solutions like homomorphic encryption. Differential privacy has been around for a while. Synthetic data, that's a very interesting one, and one we're using a lot in Trūata, which is the ability to create fake data from original data sets. And this can help when you need to use non-production data for things like testing and product development, etc. And data trust, that's a very interesting area as well that's emerging, which is really about having a third party act as a trusted data steward, and where there perhaps are multiple parties that want to come together to share data, but don't want to do it bilaterally, would want to do it from sort of many to one, and therefore they want to share with an intermediary who has governance rules. And actually, interestingly, Trūata is based in Ireland, headquartered in Ireland, but we've also been set up in Ireland as a data trust. So we're well set up to act as this third-party intermediary on behalf of a group of company. So the first question is, why anonymized data? Sometimes when I'm talking about anonymization, people will think, surely there won't be any utility left with the data when you've anonymized it. But that's not the case at all. And when we talk about anonymization or pseudonymization, what we're really talking about is an identifiability spectrum. So you can imagine you start off on the left-hand side with row-level raw data. And within data sets, you will have rich personal data, everything from a direct identifier, which would be my name and address, to indirect identifiers, which is information that might not at first glance indicate who an individual is, but when you combine the data, starts to fingerprint out an individual. But as you move along the spectrum of identifiability, you eventually, if you turn the dial and start to continually transform the data and depersonalize the data, you can arrive at anonymized data. Now, anonymized data is difficult to achieve, but essentially it's irreversible, such that you couldn't take the data set, re-engineer, and try to single out an individual. And then everything that falls within that spectrum, then from there, if you fall short of anonymization, we would call de-identified or pseudonymized data. And organizations, depending on what they're trying to achieve with the data and the context within what they're trying to do, each of these has a very valuable role to play within their data strategy. So why would an organization look to anonymize data? At its heart, the GDPR talks about this concept of purpose limitation. At its most simple, it means that when I collect data initially, I collect it for a specific purpose, and I'm supposed to continue to use the data for that purpose. But of course, business isn't as straightforward as that. Along the way, you have other uses that come to mind that you want to use for the data, in particular data analytics, because you're looking at this store of data and you want to mine this data for insights. But the GDPR talks about either you have to find the secondary purpose is compatible with the original one, or you must find a new lawful basis. And that can be very difficult, because if you're trying to rely on something like consent, you'll find that perhaps the original consent which you obtained may not stretch to this new purpose that you now have thought about you'd like to. So consent may not be available to, you might look at legitimate interest as a lawful basis, but you might ask yourself that key question: would the data subject be surprised to learn that I now plan to do this with their data than what I had originally? And if the answer to that question is yes, the data subject would be surprised to learn that you're going to use this data for this new secondary use, then the likelihood is you can't rely on legitimate interest. So also data minimization, data retention, these are principles that you have to abide by under the GDPR. And they mean that your data, the volume of data that you can use for something like analytics is actually can be quite small, because you're only supposed to use the data that you need. And for analytics, you'd like a big volume of data for longitudinal purposes. So for these reasons, organizations look to anonymization, because if you achieve true anonymization, essentially you transform the data from being personal data to being non-personal data. And that's significant because it switches off the GDPR. So the necessity to find a lawful basis is gone, and you can keep the data for as long as you want, which is very useful for longitudinal studies. Now, if you don't achieve a true anonymization, and if you're more in the realm of pseudonymization, you're caught by the GDPR, but there are still valid reasons for doing that. So just to mention, within Trūata, we were set up to provide a true anonymization service to our customers. They provide their data to us, we anonymize it, we carry out analytics and give them back aggregated insights or model code, depending on whether it's machine learning we're doing. We've also created this ability for our customers who want to self-serve on the anonymized data. We've created these tools which allow an analyst in a customer's environment to query the data without ever seeing the anonymized data, but they can still produce aggregated insights or create scripts and model codes from the data set. Why pseudonymized data? That's another question. It doesn't switch off the GDPR, but there's incredible value in pseudonymizing data. And one of the reasons is just from a data governance perspective. It means you don't have all this rich personal data flowing through your organization, being accessed by lots of different people. That can create a liability. But also, if you're doing research, Article 89 talks about the ability to repurpose data and having a presumption of compatibility, like I mentioned earlier, under Article 89, if you pseudonymize the data, because pseudonymizing data protects and safeguards the rights of the data subject. It also gives you a good grounding for the legitimate interest lawful basis that I mentioned, because you can demonstrate that you've safeguarded the rights of the individual. So very, very powerful to also pseudonymize the data. And within Trūata, we've developed a suite of tools, which are software tools. These tools can be used by a customer in their own environment. The first tool is called Calibrate. What it can do is scan all the data sets within your environment and give you a mathematical score on how rich that data set is from a point of view of direct and indirect identifiers. And then depending on the context of what you're trying to achieve, perhaps you want to share the data externally, you will want to mitigate that data set, so to reduce and depersonalize it. So Calibrate will make recommendations which columns to address, which columns to mitigate, but also where your utility lies within the columns and how to preserve utility whilst addressing the privacy. And that's where Trūata Transform comes in. It will seamlessly take the Calibrate recommendations. It will dip into a toolbox. It may generalize, it may redact, it may perturb the data, depending on what it is you're trying to achieve with the data set, and give you back a safer data set, which you can then use for whatever is the context and purpose. We also, as I mentioned, synthesize data, which is a very, very useful tool when you can't use production data, but you want to test for product development, performance testing. It will create a fake data set from an original data set, but like everything we do in Trūata, it will be tested to see, are there still risks of re-identification in that data set? So that's a whirlwind tour a little bit on some of the technical solutions that exist today to help organizations manage their privacy, but also continue to innovate with data. So back to you now.
Thanks for Aoife for that. As always, great insights there, and thank you for that. And I'm sure some of those points we'll pick up on the Q&A session later on. And as I say, for anybody listening, if they have any questions, please feel free, type it into the Q&A and we'll pick them up as best we can. Next, we have Pat. And Pat, I'm looking forward to listening to you on your presentation. And look, likewise, I'm just sharing access now, so you should have the opportunity to be able to present. Pat, you just got to unmute.
How are you doing?
Yeah.
Good morning, and great opportunity, and delighted to support ADAPT in this presentation. Excellent presentation. I still can share.
Now.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Got it? Okay, that's great.
Excellent presentation there from Aoife on privacy. Excellent. So I'll be kind of supporting that with talking about how AI in particular as a main focus of the presentation I'll be talking about in this creating tomorrow's world. And I come into this based on being a security advisor focused on security and privacy protection at our office in Brussels. And I'll be talking today about shared responsibility, data spaces, and innovation. When we talk about creating tomorrow's world, we like to talk about it as being an intelligent world like many other companies around the world. But making an intelligent world really means introducing artificial intelligence into your solutions. And whether that's in the data processing industry, we're supporting things like smart cities, industry 4.0, finance and transport, or personal devices, doing things like conversational AI, or even unlocking your phone. And then the future of autonomous AI, enabling autonomous cars and automobiles and drones and robots. And when you look at how do you do that under the cover in the engine of this capability, you can see a data pipeline here that I'm sure several people on the call will be familiar with as regards how do you actually build and enable this intelligence. And Aoife gave a great presentation on how you protect the data through the cycle, or how you convert it and use it so that you can leverage it in an AI cycle. And from a security and privacy protection perspective, you need to look at this about how you secure and protect at the model training point when you want to develop the intelligence to support the above capability, or in the deployment phase when you look to do model inference and deploy it on real data. So it's a very different way to develop solutions and software with these two different cycles. And it has a huge dependency on data, which ultimately then raises the question of privacy. You know, in Europe, Huawei is primarily a technology provider. We're helping service providers, solution providers, and application developers build AI pipelines. And that's mainly what I'll talk about today. But also we have our consumer business. And obviously in our consumer business, we have a lot of personal devices from not just the mobile phones, but PCs now, glasses, earbuds, watches, a new idea hub for collaborating in offices and PCs. So when you look at all these devices, like other suppliers around the world, question of privacy is very important. And we have some cardinal rules in the consumer business where all personal data stays on the device. The power of AI, we have AI like on the device, so you can actually do all your processing there for personal AI processing. And we have some principles like how we can keep data safe and reliable, how we can make sure that we don't sell personal data and involved in any commercial interest in doing it. Huawei is really a more of a technology provider, and also being open and transparent. Naturally, Huawei, we have a lot of focus on working with regulators and customers and users and various stakeholders on how to understand and use personal data. And that's a key role of my role in the Brussels team. When we look at that, we talked a good bit about GDPR there with Aoife's presentation. I'd just like to add a little bit around the AI regulation that's just been published on the 21st of May, which is going to guide the next step of the AI journey in Europe. And it's interesting because GDPR is about protecting data for the data subject and protecting it in the region and managing it based on European values. And AI is about really protecting Europe and making sure that we're using AI for good, that we're using AI supporting EU values, but also we're trying to leverage the power of data. And these create some conflicting requirements which need to be managed in order to help realize AI, while at the same time supporting the guiding rules and requirements of data regulation for the GDPR, which is critical and very important. So we look at this as regards it being a shared responsibility in the industry, how you can bring full stack AI technology to customers to enable solutions, and working with data scientists and application developers, data collectors, and business deployers to help enable these solutions. And when we do visits to our cybersecurity, we have an image there in the background of the center in Brussels. We take people through this and we help to explain our point of view and how we believe the industry can advance by developing this shared responsibility. One of the key things you need to look at when you're looking at building AI for solutions is the data space. What data space are you operating in? So it's not just about the cloud and building large-scale solutions, but it's also AI on devices themselves and enabling AI at the edge. And that's particularly important for enterprises who need to build an intelligent enterprise or support robotics or support other key solutions, but they want to make sure that the data stays within the enterprise, and edge AI can be a key enabler to do this. So when you're building and enabling an intelligent world, creating tomorrow's world, you need to look at the boundary of your data and as well as your ability to protect the privacy and security of that data. Just to finish, some example scenarios which I can highlight some areas where this comes into practice. We have scenarios here like in a humanitarian organization called Rainforest Connections. They're collecting data in the Amazon forest, which is sound files, and they're being processed in the cloud. And we then detect if somebody is cutting down a tree and then can send an alert to the local team to help protect the forest and protect the biosphere there And there's also further research going on. People have been able to say, now that I can listen to the forest, I can understand what's going on. And vice versa, we have another scenario happening in the south of Ireland, looking at monitoring whales and dolphins with a local partner, which is another very interesting story. Another interesting one is Sudoku, which is a French company doing retail operations. And they've advanced their solutions by doing detecting what's on your menu and what have you purchased, so that they can actually give you a bill. And this is particularly important in very large scale operations, like in our headquarters in China, where we have 30,000 staff. We do have lunch queues. So it's pretty important if we can speed that up. And this solution has been deployed now in other countries. And Sudoku, as a French company, is looking to bring that around the world. A company in Berlin doing robotics called Gerthaus Robotics. Again, robotics is quite sensitive, and it's going to be monitoring video as it goes around the factory, using LiDAR to detect objects and avoid hurting and hitting people. So obviously the top end of automation. So key there that we protect the privacy of the video collected and we keep that on the edge. And in State Grid in China, we have a very advanced scenario looking at robotics and drones monitoring the grid and obviously capturing video of the grid and what's going on there and be able to process that for very large scale inspection models. And finally, with the autonomous automotive, which was launched just recently with the first car, ArcFox, going live. And we're supporting the automotive industry for autonomous driving with AI technology and AI capability. So all these have different privacy and security requirements and need to be adapted based on the scenario of the device, the edge, and the cloud, using some of the principles and capabilities that I just talked about as well. Thank you.
That's great. Pat, thanks very much for that. Some great points of discussion there and some great use cases as well, particularly like the whales, and then we'll hear more about that in the south of Ireland, but some great use cases. So thanks for that. Pat, just turning our attention now to Ray. Ray, likewise, I'm just hopefully just giving you shared access there. You should.
Thanks, Edmund. Fantastic presentations there from both Pat and Aoife, and it's brilliant to be able to have such depth and strength when it comes to like providing information in relation to privacy from the process perspective, but also from the perspective that the technologies, like what's coming down the track. So for me, then I'm just going to spend a little bit of time setting the context in relation to some of this to try and tie the two presentations together. I didn't know in advance what was going to be in them, but I think it actually sits nicely leading up to the discussions. And also just like to say that it's a brilliant opportunity to showcase some of the research work that we're carrying out, because we are working with Trūata and working with Huawei as research partners in some of our targeted projects and some of our European research funded work as well. So it gives us an opportunity to highlight the fact that that the ADAPT Research Centre has a lot of strength and expertise in the space of privacy and trustworthiness, and working on international standards in that space. And it's great to be able to showcase through Aoife and through Pat some of the technology aspects to that as well. And what I wanted to show here is just, Pat's already alluded to some of this already, and Aoife picked up on regulation as well. So it's just to show that, like, I mean, this does exist, like we're not, and it's freely available for people to look up, but the processing of personal data is regulated by the European Union. And we have, as mentioned by Aoife already, that you have the right, to protection of your own personal data. And this is enshrined now in regulation in relation to the European Union. And you can look up the regulation, and see what the actual context is. But the first 3 lines of it, 3 bullet points there that are on the screen, show you that you're talking about movement of personal data internationally, and effectively that you have to be vigilant as to what you put out there. Like, we have to have a monitoring capability associated with the data that we share in order to preserve our own privacy. And there is an onus on individuals to be aware of the context in which you are sharing data, and not just leave it to the regulators to get it right, like to take some ownership yourself. So that's the first one. The second one then is on the Data Governance Act, which is something that is also mentioned, and Aoife alluded to more detail in relation to the GDPR, but also the fact that this allows then the sharing of larger amounts of data creates greater utility if you have access to this. And this again is enshrined in relation to regulations coming out of the European Parliament. And it also handles like the way that you can make data available, which is your own data, but in an altruistic way, for the greater good, to make that data available, to enable future trends, future technologies, and maybe future standardization issues. And then the Commission then backs that up in terms of talking about controllers and data protection officers and supervisory authorities like we put in place, so that we don't just talk about it, but we actually put processes and procedures in place that allows us to deliver on these messages. These slides are going to be available, so I'm going to try and condense mine down into maybe a 5-minute talk, if at all possible, to give us some time to discuss this at the end. But I'm just providing context here in terms of what the regulation is, what's coming out of the Parliament, like what the EU is trying to do on our behalf, and that they're not just legislating on our behalf. This is what's coming up from the member states. It's saying that this is what we require. We need to take ownership of data sovereignty in terms of what happens within the European ecosystem, data ecosystems. And we need to be aware and cognizant of consent to share, like, what am I allowing you to do? That I ultimately am responsible and should have control of my own personal data. That anonymization, and Aoife went through this in detail. Like, how am I relying on the anonymization? Like, are there trusted third parties like what Trūata are providing, and in terms of the machinery, like, so Huawei have these huge big platforms for data processing and cloud-based systems and federated data sharing based systems, open source tools, etc. And they have to provide the anonymization in terms of the technology they provide. And at the bottom of that then is this cross-cutting need, the cross-cutting need where we require privacy. We want to be able to engage in a digital environment, in digital ecosystems right across the world globally. But we are entitled to our privacy, and we are entitled to be able to trust those systems. And we are entitled to have a transparent system in place as well. So we can see not just that we have to do openly trust, that it's blind faith, but we actually can see what's happening with our data and control and monitor the data. And Aoife mentioned the last point already in terms of utility versus privacy, in terms of what Trūata and the tools that are provided. But somewhere along the line, if you are too private, then there's no data to actually consume so that we can ingest and provide utility. And if you're too open, then you're completely giving away in your privacy. So you get maximum utility, but then everybody knows who provided that data. So there has to be a happy medium. This is a spectrum, and somewhere along there we want to be able to find out where we go in a secure and trusted and open manner. And the landscape out there in relation to like what are data lakes and what are data warehouses and what are data hubs and data spaces and iSpaces and innovation hubs, there isn't a standard vocabulary yet, which gives you an exact definition and term to use. The standards are getting there. But it's something that's going to evolve over time. But there is a lot of activity. And even if you just look at the graphic on the digital innovation hubs in Europe, then you can see that there are a lot of them all over Europe, and quite a few in Ireland as well. But these innovation hubs have to maintain trust and privacy and transparency in the way they process the data of their consumers as well. Couple of projects that are involved in relation to sharing data, and we need to be actually we're engaging with them, at least within ADAPT anyway, with these projects already. But for other parties, other industry partners, just to be aware of the likes of the EU hubs for data, like that is a true data hub, like where you can get added value and more utility out of your data by being in a data space. GAIA-X is a federated data sharing environment, which came out of France and Germany, original partners. But now I think there's about 14 member states who are up to the situation where they're ready to launch their own national GAIA-X hubs. And Ireland is one of those that's preparing one. International data spaces then for looking at the broad picture of global data. and trying to come up with mechanisms and terms and standards, at least advisory output towards standardization, because they're not an SSO, a standard setting organization, or a standards development organization, but they can advise on where there may be some gaps in and needs coming up. And then in relation to that, then from a contextual point of view, we need to look at, well, where's our own national AI strategy, like which National Standards Authority of Ireland are looking at from a standards perspective, and Enterprise Ireland are looking at from an enterprise perspective. Where are we in relation to a national data governance strategy, data governance standards research, because this is what privacy is core to. And federated data sharing initiatives like IX, for example, or other ones, like, how are they going to impact on our approach to data sharing? And compliance, standards, which the likes of Subcommittee 42 for ISO have a working group 3, which completely on trustworthiness. Regulation, which Aoife mentioned already in relation to some of the GDPR, and then cited some of the European Parliament regulations as well. And then legislation where we're going to have laws and penalties associated with non-compliance. So if people abuse your personal data and don't behave in a professional manner, or expose your data when you have a right to actually not having that data exposed. So that's pretty much it. And I just wrap up really quickly to allow some time to process questions at the end. Back to you, Edmund.
Oh, that's great, Ray. Thanks very much for that. And in fact, thanks to both Ray, Aoife, and Pat for all those presentations. They were really insightful and lots of detail. And I'm sure, based on even the content of those 3 presentations, we could spend a couple of hours debating and discussing some of those topics. But alas, we've only got 10 minutes, guys, or thereabouts. And just to say, by way of just for to the audience, so we will share all these presentations after this webinar with any information that's available. So all this will be shared in the next week to 10 days. Folks, just listen, just as a broad opening question, if I may, to all 3 of you, and it's in reference to a 2020 Forbes article that I came across last year, and it was talking about predictions in 2021. And the headline of that, and I thought it was interesting at the time, was that privacy becomes an imperative in a year of transition. And that was the focus and one of the main headline predictions for 2021 and beyond. So there was a very real sense from reading it that we're on the cusp of a real paradigm shift or a momentum in this space, for companies to really engage and be proactive. Turning to you, Aoife, first, is this something that you're seeing with your customers and what's happening in your space?
Undoubtedly. I think there's almost a parallel with maybe the security world or the cybersecurity world, even 10 years ago, where, it was a nascent industry and new solutions were coming to the fore. I think in many organizations, as data has been considered, there's been a person absent from the table, and that is the privacy officer. And I think that person is now occupying a seat at the table. And privacy is something now that's been considered in a way that's different and distinct from security. And that is data. What can we do with data? What are the constraints? But also, how do we demonstrate to those individuals whose data we've collected that we are actually going to be responsible? There has been a bit of a techlash. There's been a bit of creepiness where consumers and citizens have said, what's happening to my data? I don't trust these organizations. And organizations are realizing that, as you said, Edmund, it goes way beyond compliance. It really goes to the heart of their data strategy. And if you're constantly on the back foot looking at regulation, which is emerging all over the world, and saying, it's a patchwork, are we going to be able to comply? That's not good enough. You've got to actually take 1 or 2 steps forward in order to future-proof your strategy. So that requires some leadership and looking at things like anonymization, pseudonymization, and technology solutions that will actually copper fasten and future-proof your data strategy so that you are proactive and not reactive, but also that you can demonstrate in a significant way to your citizens and your consumers that you take this seriously and that you are being responsible and ethical. So therefore it's complying not with just the letter of the law, but as you said, the spirit of the law. So definitely, I think, you know, and COVID has done that as well. I think we are seeing a transformation. And if you look at the market, look at what Apple is doing, look at what Google is doing, look what's happening in that space. They're taking leadership positions around this issue of privacy.
Yeah, thanks for that, Aoife. And actually, building on some of Aoife's comments, turning to you, Pat. You know, as a solutions provider of Huawei, are you seeing those sort of trends being reflected in your space at company level and beyond?
Well, yeah, like, you know, Huawei is still a relatively young company, but has grown tremendously. And, you know, about 10 years ago, as we made the shift to focus from communications into ICT, our founder, Mr. Raymond Fay, decided that security and privacy protection were absolutely going to become the critical number one top priority for the company. And he set up this global cybersecurity and privacy protection organization 10 years ago. So he decided from the start that they both needed to be in the same overall top level leadership with dedicated cybersecurity officers and also dedicated data protection officers, because they're two roles. They're very complementary, but they are quite different and they have to do different things. So that was the first thing I think that was really critical. I think the second thing is you can't really do this outside your organization unless you really adopt it within your organization. So then we looked at how we could adopt these capability across the whole elements of the organization, from strategy to R&D to sales to development, security, support. All these capabilities across the company were important. And then you're in a position to help engage the stakeholders in a meaningful way. And we continue to need to improve on how we explain our capabilities. And that's why we're dedicating these transparency centers to help start that engagement and keep talking and look at the challenges that the industry is now facing, because they're growing every day.
That's interesting, Pat. And actually, what I do like, just picking up on one of your points, I like this idea of data governance having a seat at the top table, which I think is crucial for any sort of industry that is working in that space. And like turning to you, Ray, you know, from your work with Adapt and at a national and a European level, because you probably see as much of that moving to a multi sort of stakeholder engagement. You know, so this is a broad ecosystem here that we're talking about. Are you seeing a lot of momentum there?
Yeah, absolutely, Edwin. Yeah, and it just ties together both Aoife and Pat's points as well. Is that data governance and standards like has become core to future business strategies. If you're going to create new business revenue streams, which are data oriented, then you have to have a data governance remit within your company. And this is happening right across the board. At European level, etc. And as Aoife said, digital transformation has been accelerated by COVID. We have been forced out of our offices to use new platforms and new tools, which allow us to continue on doing our business. And that's not going to change now, because in a post-COVID environment, the efficiencies and performance enhancement that has resulted with these data sharing platforms and communication platforms have made us more productive and made our lives easier to a certain extent as well. So that's going to be part of the new normal, as they call it now, for going forward. And we're going to have a situation like, you know, where we're going to be continuously engaging, you know, from a research point of view with innovative and adaptive companies who are pushing the boundary of future privacy, future governance strategies to create the next generation of tools and technologies that will allow us to maintain that, because the future is about trust. In this digitally accelerated environment with massive transformation happening globally, trust is going to be the core of all of this. You can't have trust without privacy. And creating platforms where we have that trustworthiness built in, where we have some mechanisms, and it's up to us, you know, the industry partners and the research centers to come up with ways of helping consumers, everyday citizens, to be compliant, you know, with GDPR. to avail of tools and technologies, hopefully some of which are free and open source, but then others which are paid services to allow us to do it at an enterprise level, but for SMEs and startups, and it's one of the things as mentioned in the chat there, it can maybe difficult to get access to the tools and technologies and the research centers to be able to do this. And there's always some level of engagement that you can do with research centers. Like even SMEs and startups can become partners in large organizations with Empower, with say the national governance initiatives, with AI strategies which are being pushed out. So I think for the future is bright. There is a lot of really innovative companies out there like Trūata and Huawei who are creating these platforms and creating the services, the tools, the technologies and the techniques to allow us to live in a more transparent, more private, more trustworthy world.
That's great, Ray. Thanks for that. And actually, just looking at some questions that are coming through on the floor from on Q&A, and actually one for you, Aoife, if I may. There's one or two. One from an anonymous attendee was talking about, in terms of compliance with GDPR, and it was a question I was going to ask myself actually, in terms of, it certainly seems to be easier and more affordable for large organizations than for SMEs. So how are SMEs, how do they fare in that sort of sense in terms of accessing technologies to ensure they can comply with GDPR?
Yeah, I mean, clearly GDPR applies to any business that collects personal data. So if you've one employee or one customer, you're caught by the GDPR. Obviously, if you're a huge organization or if data is at the heart of what you do, then there's more issues in terms of how you're exposed to the GDPR. But all SMEs need to understand how to manage personal data. Certainly, there are tools available there which are scaled down for SMEs. We specifically developed our software tools so that they could be easy to use, easy to deploy, and priced at a point that would be accessible by SMEs and medium-sized companies as well. So I think, the privacy tech sector is a young sector, it's nascent, but the tools that are being developed are not just focused on large organizations, they are being developed so that they can be used also by SMEs, and particularly those that perhaps don't have staff that might be very literate when it comes to AI or ML and other things, but that these are easy to use from that perspective.
All right, well, thanks for that, Aoife. And just a quick question to Pat, just picking up, and I know that privacy has become sort of central to, as you say, the application within your product ranges and how you build, but within the role of the Cybersecurity Transparency Center, is that sort of shared link and responsibility, across, not only stakeholders within Huawei, but externally? I'm sure it's coming across through the emergence of tech areas of 5G and IoT and cloud and AI and so on and so forth. And what are you doing? How can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's some individuals who are just dedicated to privacy and focused on that's their domain. They're in the data protection office team and in our center, and that's the key focus of those experts. And there's some of us then that are in domain areas like IoT and cloud and AI. And in our case, we have to look at both security and privacy protection. In my case, to look to advance this, one of the examples I would give is I'm starting to engage with the Eclipse organization in Brussels. They've approached us about how do we look at AI and privacy for SMEs. I know that was one of the questions. And I think, getting and enabling the SME community and how we can get maybe some more open source tools to them and help explain to them how to address it might be a way to help address the SME challenge. But there are other examples. We're working with GaiaX, we're working with a whole bunch of universities in Europe. And in Ireland, Derek Collins in the Ireland Research Centre and Luke MacDonald in the market unit are focusing on supporting the universities and the market partners here. So it's a team, and everybody's working it across Huawei to try and drive it.
And Ray, I'm aware of times we'll wrap up fairly soon, but in terms of from a European perspective, you're probably seeing that too, in terms of that sort of multi-stakeholder engagement and collaborations, not only with industry, but right across all the various sort of sectors and stakeholders that are involved in that. You're seeing much more in that in terms of some of the projects you're working on?
sorry, I put myself on mute there just to
That's
stop
all right.
the clicking of the keyboard. Yeah, absolutely. You know, because what we're finding now is that data has become core to everything. It's my mantra now that there is no big data, there is no cloud data, there is no AI data, smart cities data. There's just data, and the rest of it is just context. You know, so in relation to data, there is a lot of EU hubs related data and shared data projects going on at the moment, including Gaia X. There are a lot of collaborative projects within Big Data Value Association, PPPs, between the European Observatory for ICT Standards. A lot of this is overlapping, you know, in terms of there's this synergy between those larger consortia, and it brings a lot of these issues together in relation to looking at, well, how can we build a technology, you know, how can we maximize utility, how can we create a trusted and shared and private environment, like, you know, for doing some of our computations and our analytics. And the part of the problem is not on the technology level. It's on the pulling of players together, and I've seen more and more of that happening. You know, through, you know, the European Commission's initiatives, like, you know, through the large organisations like you know, the public-private partnerships, BDVA and Cyber, etc. Looking at the instruments that they're setting up in relation to the European Observatory and for ICT standards, but also in relation to work that's happening with the World Economic Forum and United Nations. They're all looking at this, like the G20. They're all looking at data as been, you know, one of the project creators, you know, in terms of the number of global and European projects that's going to come out of creating trusted, secure, private, open data sharing environments like that people can rely on for the next, you know, 15 years potentially, like, you know, really long-term horizons on this. So it's yeah, I mean, it's brilliant to see the perspective from Huawei, because they're at the technology forefront, like from a framework point of view, and also from Trūata, looking at privacy in so much detail, and how to ensure that capability for their customers and for citizens. So it's yeah, a lot of stuff happening.
A lot of stuff. Listen, Ray, thanks very much for that. And I can see there's a lot of questions there that have come through in the last minute or so. So we will come back after the webinar and we will answer all these questions. They will be picked up and we'll go back directly. And in fact, you know, some very good questions coming through. So I'll just maybe finish with a sort of 1 minute sort of or a quick question to each of you. And then I'll just wrap up, because I have promised people let them get back to their day-to-day work as soon as possible. So just by way of, I suppose, as a last parting question to each of you, you know, to sort of products or initiatives or trends that you see, you know, emerging in the next sort of 12 to 18 months, you know, either at a company level or at a sort of research level, you know, just a very quick one-liner. What do you see happening? Aoife?
Yeah, I see a different sort of a shift in a mindset as regards privacy, where it may have been seen as compliance. You're seeing companies now who are taking a privacy-centric approach, a privacy-first approach. They're understanding that it gives them a competitive edge. They understand that it's going to future-proof what they do. They want to work with data. They want to innovate with data, but they understand that at the heart of it, as Ray mentioned, trust is an imperative in there. So they're saying, okay, let's use this. There is an ROI on privacy. This will enhance our business. Let's do it. It's the right thing to do, but it's also good for the business. And that's what we're seeing now emerging.
Thanks, Aoife. And Pat?
Yeah, I think to enable this whole trusted environment, transparency is going to be key. And really in all aspects of the business and in aspects to privacy and security, and how the technology is being developed from a quality perspective as well as from a privacy perspective. All these things need to be addressed and are key to building confidence in the community on our solutions and using the applications, because people don't trust them, they won't want to use them. True,
very true. And Ray?
Yeah, finally, just to add to what Aoife and Pat said, like, I mean, I've seen a big change globally, you know, at European level and now nationally as well, in relation to standards, that we have to have standards for privacy, standards for trust, standards for platform technologies, and that's something that's growing at pace. And what I'd be trying to do is to facilitate further engagement for other partners, enterprise partners like Trūata and Huawei, who already do engage in standardization, but to bring the next generation of standards enterprise partners on board through collaborative projects with Adapt.
All right, well, that's great. Listen, thanks, Aoife and Pat and Ray. There's a great conversation there, and we could certainly go on. And I know we're well over time at this stage, but it was fascinating to listen to you all. So we're just about out of time. So just to wrap up, and it certainly does feel like, going back to my original question, that we are certainly on the cusp of a huge momentum. You have technologists and investors and regulators and consumers and enterprise customers all in agreement with privacy experts and advocates. And certainly where data is more of an asset than a liability, and can create sort of almost that sort of sense of like brand equity, data equity for companies if they're proactive. And it very much aligns with what we do at the Adapt Center, which is about protecting privacy and deploying responsible AI, and and ethically using emerging tech as key success factors for business and for the greater good as well. So we've covered a lot in the last sort of 50 minutes or so. As a reference point, if you need any more information or clarification, please reach out to the adaptcenter.ie. You'll find a lot more information on industry use cases there, or on the broader research sort of where we're operating across a lot of those topics. So for now, I just want to thank once again Aoife, Pat, and Ray. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in June on eHealth. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon.
Thanks very much, Edmund, and thanks to all the Adapt staff as well.